Thanks for joining us and welcome to the program. We're switching gears tonight and we're talking history, particularly the history of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. What was that holiday? What is behind it historically? And we're joined by two historians. Andrea Berlin is an archaeologist from Boston University. Yonder, Gillihan is a professor at Boston College. You're involved in the Maccabee Project, which is a sort of I guess you would say, a historic and even a scientific look at the story of Hanukkah, the story of the period in history, and some of what is myth versus fact in that analysis. But before we go there, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the story of Hanukkah for our listeners. Yonder, why don't you start out? What is the story of Hanukkah from a historic standpoint?
From a historical standpoint?
Yes.
Or I think perhaps the traditional standpoint is the one that that you're asking me to discuss. This is the story that is celebrated at the festival of Hanukkah, when families gather and sing songs, spin the dreidel, and celebrate 8 days of the miracle of the cruse of oil that was not exhausted. It contained a single, according to the Talmud, it contained a single day's supply of oil and lasted 8 days instead, miraculously, providing light for the temple until more oil could come to replace it.
Now, this came about because of a rebellion by Matisyahu and his 5 sons, who were known as the Maccabees, which means the hammer. And then
they weren't all known as the Maccabees.
I think
just Judah was known
was
as the Maccabee.
And then the family is the Hasmoneans, which developed a dynasty. And what it was is it has political and religious significance historically, at least from our conventional understanding. The religious significance was that the Greeks, who had controlled the region at the time, they were the antecedents of Alexander the Great. They controlled Syria under Antiochus. They were oppressing the Jewish people in their religion. And there was also a sort of a semi-civil war in Judea between the Hellenized Jews, the secularized Jews, if you will, and the more religious Jews, which were represented historically, at least by conventional wisdom, by the Hasmonean family. And so they decided to take matters into their own hands and launch a military rebellion against the Greeks, both to say what they felt was to save Judaism as a faith, but also to obtain political independence, and they were successful.
I think you're summarizing the traditional narration very, very nicely, and I think this is definitely the story with which people are most familiar. Right. The action of Antiochus IV, the king of Syria, in 167 BCE, he came into the temple. And as part of his campaign to try to impose a uniform religion on all of his subject territories, he outlawed the traditional ancestral cult of Judea and forced them, to worship the gods of Greece.
Now, didn't he set up a statue of Zeus in the temple?
In the temple.
So it was very aggravating to
sacrificed
Jews.
a pig to it.
Yeah.
Okay. This is egregious.
Sure.
and drew quite a lot of attention. Besides this, in First Maccabees, you have a description of the pagan altar set up in Modane, where the Hasmoneans live.
Right.
And their involvement begins with a Greek official arriving, presenting the statue, requiring everyone to come or inviting them, to worship. Mattathias stands up and says, "Not as long as I'm here or over my dead body." And when a Jew steps forward to offer sacrifice, he slays him and the official, and the action gets underway.
So that's triggered the war. Then they flee to the hills. There's several battles. The brothers eventually, Judah does achieve sovereignty. He purifies the temple with the 7 days, according to legend. And then there's a succession of brothers, all of whom fight, some of whom are killed, until they reach Simon, who actually consolidates a pretty sizable sovereign empire, although with Roman acquiescence, I understand. the gift sent to Rome, to keep Rome on their side. And then his son, John Hyrcanus, was a zealous emperor. He was both a high priest and king, and he expanded the borders. It's the only time in Jewish history where he actually tries to forcibly convert people on the borders, like the Idumeans. And he was just, he really created a pretty substantial both political and religious state.
Yes. Again, the popular summary, you're summarizing very well. It's interesting how the sources are very honest about the difficulty that the Hasmoneans had in confronting the Greeks. They didn't actually achieve independence until around, 104 BCE? So it was a good 70 years before they reclaimed full, what you would call sovereignty. Or I suppose, 134 you might?
It's after Antiochus VII dies in 129, so it's already, it's in the 120s.
And who was the head of the state at that time? Was it Simon?
Hyrcanus.
Hyrcanus, okay. And, in a way, this gets to the significance of the Hanukkah holiday, both religious and political. It stands for the development or the establishment of a sovereign state, a small sovereign state, that stood up for itself and created its own borders, its own destiny, but also it represents religious freedom. They were like, this is our religion, we're not going to be changed by the Greek overlords. We're going to
It
practice.
represents religious freedom and also a very singular religious attitude, because the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean, was a very busy place theologically. There were gods everywhere, every people, every land, every city. And the Greek speakers and Latin speakers, Greeks and Romans, were fine with having lots and lots of deities, nature deities and sky deities. And so it wasn't only the freedom to practice, it was the idea that no other gods would be allowed in this territory.
So in a sense, Hyrcanus, he saved Judaism in a lot of ways by not only establishing a strong sovereignty, but creating and recreating the religion as the high priest. Then his son, his second son, became king, Alexander Jannaeus, who was completely evil, very bad guy.
One could argue that Hyrcanus wasn't so great either.
Well, from
and Simon, in fact, gets a pretty bad rap in the Talmud.
But that's okay.
Okay, my source on it's Josephus, and Josephus is a big fan.
Of Hyrcanus, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, his mistake was the forcible conversions, and that, of course, came back to bite them later in the form of Herod. But you have then Alexander Jannaeus, who was a very evil king. He was crucifying people. He was insane, from what I've read.
But he was disliked by
despised,
he had bodyguards when he went to the Temple Mount.
Yeah, John Hyrcanus was opposed by the Pharisees, who had the support of the people. So there's quite a bit of popular
rumbling
problems with Hyrcanus already. And Simon, who presented himself as, he presented himself in purple.
As very priestly. Yeah.
They avoided using the title king until
Jannaeus.
Aristobulus, right before Alexander. Aristobulus, his brother, was the first to wear the crown, and then Jannaeus after him, and then the others.
Now, the other thing with Jannaeus, I understand, is that there was still the conflict between the Hellenized Jews and the religious Jews. The Hellenized Jews, from what I understand, and you're the experts, they became what's known as the Sadducees. It was like a cult of focused mostly on the temple worship and also kind of embracing Greek practices. Whereas the Pharisees, who were the fathers of the Talmudic rabbis, they were more what we now think of as conventional Judaism.
That's a fascinating summary. The Sadducees
maybe I'm up.
as the more Greek.
Weren't they though? And they also were more the literalists.
Well,
and
the
that
Sadducees.
Jannaeus fell under the influence of the Sadducees, and that was part of the problem.
His father, John Hyrcanus, is the one who moves away from the Pharisees after he's criticized, adopts the Sadducean law as the law by which he governs his life. But the Sadducees seem to be much more conservative, much more traditional than the Pharisees. Sadducees don't adopt this Pharisaic notion of an afterlife. The Sadducees don't have the whole, pantheon of angels, and they only read the Torah. They don't have the oral law.
The oral law.
They're also much more, they're much stricter in their halakha than the Pharisees.
Their law.
Really?
Much, yeah. Their interpretation of, and in fact, they're closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls sect than they are to the rabbis or to Philo.
Maybe another offshoot of Judaism that came on much later, centuries later, would be in that same realm, and that would be the Karaites, but that's another subject.
That's a good pretty far afield.
We have then, after Jannaeus finally dies, and he was a terrible king, and he ripped, he tore apart the country. You had his wife, Shalomit Zion, Salome, who was great, who was there for 10 years, who restored order. Now, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrea, is that her brother, Shimon Shetak, was a great Judaic scholar, and he established what we could call a first education system.
So the rabbis say.
So the rabbis say. Children would be educated. He brought it out of the realm of the temple, and he brought education to people. And it was a short-lived golden era. Of course, when Shalomit Zion dies, her two sons have a civil war, and that is Aristobulus and Hyrcanus II. And one is used by the Romans and the other by the Persians, and eventually the Romans take advantage, of course, and they walk in and take over.
The two big superpowers of the day.
Yeah, that's right. So the country basically didn't lose sovereignty overnight. It was a gradual process. Herod came along, who was half Idumean. He was a strong king, but completely sponsored by the Romans. There was a period there where the Persians took over under Antigonus.
Oh, that's very quick.
Okay.
Just a few years.
And that's where you get Hillel's prose bull, because Jerusalem was starving to death in the Shemitah year. We're getting off subject. Anyway, let's go right to your research in the Maccabee Project. Andrea, talk a little bit about what the Maccabee Project is doing.
The Maccabee Project is designed to bring together people like Yonder, who's a scholar who works in texts, and people like me, who is an archaeologist. Normally our paths don't cross too much, and yet we work on material and do research on topics that are the same, just from two different vantage points. Mm-hmm. It would be a little bit like if some future archaeologist was interested in 21st century America and only studied music but didn't study movies, and somebody else only studied movies, and then they never talked to each other. You wouldn't get a very good picture of what was really happening. So the Maccabees Project is an attempt to teach us how to talk to each other in a way where we can actually get something out of it. We have to learn some new tricks.
Okay, and you have extensive background in Israel, working in archaeology going back to the 1970s.
I do.
You've also been involved recently as the chief advisor to a particular project in the northern Galilee that has some relation to the Hasmonean period. Am I right about that?
You are mostly right about that.
Okay.
So I'm the co-director of an excavation up on the northern border of Israel. It's exactly on the Lebanese border, not too far from the modern town of Kiryat Shmona, so way up in the north. The site is called Tel Kedesh. When we first started digging there, we went, my co-director, who's from the University of Michigan, and we went because we were interested in another group of people that you don't hear a lot about in this region, the Phoenicians.
Right.
You don't hear a lot about them because they didn't write very much about themselves down.
Now, can I just interject here? The Phoenicians in the Torah or in the writings are referred to as the Sidonians. Well,
the Phoenicians in the biblical texts are Canaanites.
Right, but particularly in Tyre and Sidon, they were allies of Solomon. They helped build the first temple. You had there was actually quite a relationship. I mean, there was trade. Simon Abiff, I believe, he was a builder, married to a Jewish woman. He helps put together some of the ritual elements.
Right, so all of those traditions come from the earlier first millennium BCE, from the early biblical period, and those traditions reflect the reality that the cities on the coast, Sidon and Tyre and what is today Beirut even, and Byblos, they were very large, very wealthy cities with access to a lot of resources like wood for the mountains, cedars, goods from the sea because they were on the coast, whereas Judea was small and poor and inland and didn't have a lot of resources, so it behooved the king to have a good relationship with.
It's a good model for today. I mean, I think Sidon taught Solomon how to build a navy, and they were great seafaring people. I mean, they built Carthage.
That's right.
They were trading all over the Mediterranean and even up to Great Britain, I believe. So you had this alliance between two people, at both at the height of their powers.
Well, so that's the thing that's interesting. We can tell that the Phoenicians, in their various city-states, Sidon and Tyre, for example, were exactly as you say. They were powerful, they had monarchs, they had foreign relations, they had long-term trading networks across the Mediterranean, and yet we keep forgetting about them when we write the history of this area and period because they didn't write their history. They were not.
So, but yet weren't they the founders of the written, like the word phonics comes from Phoenician.
I don't know about that, but the alphabet comes from there.
But that's what I mean. I mean, it's a phonetic alphabet. The English alphabet is phonetic being of Phoenicia.
And the alpha and the beta of the alphabet are the first two letters of the Phoenician alphabet.
Right. So your research in Tel Kadesh is uncovering Phoenician artifacts?
What happened was we went to look for Phoenicians because nobody was looking for Phoenicians, and we knew they were there, and we were interested in them. And in the course of it, I ran into the Maccabees by accident. The site that we discovered, the building that we discovered at the site, which is an enormous 20,000 square foot administrative compound, so huge, really huge, was built in around 500 BCE, was abandoned in a hurry, in haste, with whole things just lying on the floor. People fled sometime in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. That I could tell from the archaeological remains, but of course I wondered, why?
What happened?
What happened?
Right.
So nobody left a note telling me. So I went looking at some of the contemporary textual material about the era and found a verse in 1 Maccabees, chapter 11, that seemed to offer a completely valid, unproblematic explanation. In this verse, it says that the Maccabean Jonathan, who is one of the youngest brothers of Judah, who by this time is dead.
Right.
And Jonathan is the dude in charge. So this verse says that Jonathan went to Kadesh in Galilee, my site, and it names it twice, and defeated a Seleucid force.
Okay.
That's the army of the Antiochus and the Greek Seleucid army. And although no specific date is given in the text, it's BCE, they weren't dating things according to the way we date things, but from the trajectory of the narrative, you can tell that this event must have occurred in the decade of the 140s BCE. And I could tell from the specific remains that we had that something happened at the site in the 140s, and then the site was, at least temporarily, abandoned. So for quite a long time, I had no compunction about putting these two pieces of evidence together. The text says Jonathan was here in the 140s. The archaeological remains say something happened here in the 140s. It's the right place, it's the right time, no problem.
And this is really the way that the texts have been used to interpret the archaeology. And then textual scholars will ask an archaeologist, so what is there at this time in the ground? And say, okay, there's this site, that's what the text is describing. An assumption, there's a perfect correlation between the sets of evidence.
So what did you actually find there? I mean, you say there was this battle between the Seleucids and Jonathan. Was Jonathan the one that was killed by the horse or that was the other brother.
Which one is, you mean the elephant or the?
Oh, the elephant.
The elephant.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that is not Jonathan.
Okay, that might have been Eliezer or one
Yeah,
of
I
the
think
other
that's
brothers.
Eliezer.
But
Right.
but what
did we find?
When you look at a site like that, what is it that I mean, did you find actual evidence of the Phoenicians and the Hasmoneans? I mean, was there things that you could identify as such?
Well, so I have to reel back your question a little bit. But quickly to say, we didn't find anything that has anything to do with the Maccabees. So I found tons of stuff that have to do with the Phoenicians, for sure. Found lots of material, pottery, and imported goods that must have come from Tyre. We can tell by doing
Did you find a Shera?
A what?
You know, the
an
idols. Asherah, yeah.
No, this is not that period.
Oh, okay.
Those are from the Iron Age, and so in the 9th and the 8th and the 7th
That might have been the
centuries BC.
Philistines also.
No, the
They're
Judeans
everywhere.
had them. The Judeans had them. But after the end of the First Temple period and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, those particular kind of figurines disappear.
Okay.
This was an administrative site.
Okay.
They were great big storerooms for grain, huge jars as tall as me that held grain, which we know because we did residue analysis. And we found reception rooms with painted walls and mosaic floors.
Wow.
And we found fancy dishes sitting on the floor and wine jars imported from the Greek island of Rhodes. So the administrators here had the ability to have very nice parties.
Right.
So we found evidence for prosperity and the collection of agricultural goods, which was probably for tax collection. We found evidence of an archive with records, and the records had been on papyrus rolls, and they'd been sealed by clay bullae that had been stamped, and some of the stamps have writing on them. So some of the writing indicates that there are direct connections with the Phoenician coast, because some of the stamps that had sealed the papyri come from the coast. So we found lots of evidence that it was Phoenician.
Sure.
But what I came to realize is that any explanation that made sense of all of the remains that we found, which are incontrovertible, they're physical and they're there, any explanation that made sense of all the remains could not really accommodate the story in First Maccabees. And that was a problem.
So what you found then was the overwhelming evidence was the Phoenicians. It had nothing to do with the Seleucids or the battle with the Maccabees.
It might have had something to do with the Seleucids, because whoever was working at this site in the 2nd century BC was working on behalf of the Seleucids.
Okay.
And they never come back.
But weren't the Phoenicians sort of out of the picture at that point? In that, I mean, they were certainly in Carthage, but I mean, didn't they sort of lose their identity after Alexander? And
now, see, Chuck, I would have to say to you, on what basis would you come up with that idea? And I know what basis it is.
Right.
It's writing.
Right. I mean,
that is why
that.
we have archaeology.
Okay. So in other words, you've discovered something very, very unusual here, which is that there continued to be a Phoenician civilization, a very prosperous one,
absolutely,
in the Hellenic era,
and
in
powerful.
that region, which makes sense.
It does.
I mean, this was a well-to-do, wealthy, extremely influential society that
that's right.
Not just created Carthage, but I mean, Carthage was huge.
It was.
Okay, we're going to take a break shortly, so we're going to have public service, and you're watching Chuck Morse Speaks. We're talking the story of Hanukkah, the story of the Greek period in history in the region of Judea, and your archaeological discoveries, which I think I want to get back to that. I mean, this is amazing. So, but having said this, what you found is okay. Yeah, we're on a break. Thank you very much. Okay.
So good to see you guys. So, what's up?
Oh, we finally bought a place.
Holy cow.
You seriously have enough saved to do that?
We've been